in the heart of southeastern Africa, where the towering peaks of the Drakensberg Mountains cascade down toward the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, there existed a land of rolling grasslands, scattered thornbush, and river valleys that sustained countless communities for millennia. This was a region of extraordinary beauty and occasional harshness, where the summer rains could transform the landscape into verdant paradise, and where winter droughts tested the resilience of every living thing. The climate was generally hospitable, characterized by hot, humid summers and mild, dry winters, creating ideal conditions for both agriculture and cattle herding. The soil, though not uniformly fertile, supported the cultivation of sorghum and later maize, while the lightly wooded grasslands provided perfect grazing for the prized Nguni cattle that would become central to the identity and wealth of the people who called this place home. This land between the mountains and the sea was inhabited by numerous Nguni-speaking communities, descendants of the great Bantu migrations that had swept southward over centuries, bringing with them knowledge of ironworking, agriculture, and complex social organization. These were not primitive peoples struggling for survival, but sophisticated societies with intricate political structures, rich oral traditions, and carefully developed methods of governance and conflict resolution. The Nguni peoples had organized themselves into numerous chiefdoms, each typically consisting of several thousand people who shared common ancestry and cultural practices. These chiefdoms were largely autonomous, ruled by hereditary chiefs who governed with the advice of councils of elders and maintained their authority through a complex web of kinship obligations, cattle transactions, and ritual responsibilities. The traditional way of life for these southeastern African communities revolved around cattle, which served not merely as a source of food, but as the primary measure of wealth, the medium of exchange in important transactions, and the centerpiece of religious and social rituals. A man's status within the community was directly related to the size of his herd, and cattle played essential roles in marriage negotiations, where they were transferred as bride wealth, cementing alliances between families and clans. The cattle kept by these communities were of a distinctive breed, the Nguni cattle, perfectly adapted to local conditions with their remarkable hide patterns, each hide being unique and almost perfectly symmetrical. These animals were hardy, resistant to local diseases, and able to thrive on the native grasses, providing not only meat, but also milk, which was fermented into amasi, a staple food and cultural touchstone. The agricultural cycle complemented the pastoral focus, with women primarily responsible for cultivating crops, while men tended the herds. Homesteads, called umuzi in the Zulu language, were typically arranged in a circular pattern, with the chief's dwelling at the highest point, and those of his family and dependents arranged below. These settlements were carefully organized, with designated areas for cattle enclosures, grain storage, and various domestic activities. The spatial arrangement reflected social hierarchies and kinship relationships, creating a physical manifestation of the community's social order. Within each homestead, traditional beehive-shaped huts, made of woven branches and grass thatch, provided shelter, their design perfected over generations to withstand the region's weather while remaining relatively simple to construct and maintain. Before the great transformations that would mark the early 19th century, warfare among these Nguni communities followed established patterns that, while occasionally deadly, were far less catastrophic than what was to come. Conflicts between chiefdoms typically arose over cattle, grazing rights, water access, or matters of honor and prestige. When diplomacy failed and war became necessary, the traditional form of combat involved both sides meeting at an agreed-upon location, often in an open area between their territories. Warriors would advance toward their opponents, brandishing their weapons and shouting challenges and insults, working themselves into a state of aggressive readiness while demonstrating their courage and martial prowess. The primary weapon in these traditional conflicts was the long-throwing spear, a weapon perhaps 6 to 8 feet in total length, with a relatively narrow iron blade attached to a long wooden shaft. Warriors would typically carry several of these spears, hurling them at their opponents from a distance before closing for hand-to-hand combat if necessary. Shields, made from cowhide stretched over a wooden frame, provided protection and were also used as status symbols, with different hide patterns indicating a warrior's regiment and age group. The actual fighting, while certainly dangerous, often resulted in relatively few casualties, as the emphasis was as much on demonstration of courage and the settling of specific disputes as it was on wholesale slaughter of the enemy. These conflicts served important social functions beyond the immediate military objectives. They provided young men with opportunities to prove their bravery and earn status within their communities. They allowed chiefdoms to assert their power and defend their interests without necessarily destroying their neighbors, who might be needed as allies against other threats or as trading partners in times of peace. The warfare was seasonal, typically conducted during times when agricultural demands were lighter and when the disruption to normal community life could be minimized. There was a ritualistic quality to much of this fighting, with established protocols for when battles would begin and end, how prisoners might be treated, and how peace could be restored once honor had been satisfied. Yet beneath this relatively stable pattern of life, forces were gathering that would transform the region utterly. Competition for control of trade routes to Delagoa Bay, where Portuguese merchants offered European goods in exchange for ivory and other valuable commodities, was intensifying. Population growth was placing increased pressure on land and resources, while periodic droughts created additional stress. Some chiefdoms were beginning to consolidate their power, absorbing smaller neighbors and building larger political units. The stage was being set for dramatic change, though few could have anticipated just how profound that transformation would be, or that it would come through the vision and brutal effectiveness of a young man who had been cast out of his own community as an illegitimate child. The various chiefdoms of the region maintained complex relationships with one another, sometimes allied, sometimes rivals, but always connected through networks of trade, intermarriage, and shared cultural traditions. Among these many small polities, the Zulu people were just one clan among many, unremarkable in their size or power, numbering perhaps no more than 1,500 people at the beginning of the 19th century. Their chief, Senzanga Kona, ruled over a modest territory, and there was little to suggest that within a generation, the Zulu name would be known and feared across hundreds of miles, representing one of the most formidable military powers in the entire African continent. The transformation that would elevate the Zulu from obscurity to dominance would be the work of one man whose genius for military innovation and ruthless determination would reshape the entire region. But that same transformation would come at an immense cost in human suffering and would set in motion a chain of events that historians would debate for centuries to come. The people of this region possessed a deep spiritual life, believing in a creator God who remained somewhat distant from daily affairs, while ancestors played a much more immediate role in the lives of the living. These ancestral spirits were believed to watch over their descendants, offering protection and guidance when properly honored, but capable of causing misfortune if neglected or offended. Communication with the ancestors required the services of diviners, known as sangomas, who would enter trance states to receive messages from the spirit world. Herbalists, called inyangas, prepared powerful medicines from plants, minerals, and animal parts, creating remedies for physical ailments and protective charms against spiritual dangers. This rich spiritual tradition permeated every aspect of life, from birth through death, marking important transitions and providing explanations for the inexplicable. The social structure of these communities was firmly patriarchal, with men holding formal authority and making major decisions. though women exercise considerable informal power, especially within the domestic sphere. Polygamy was practiced by men of means, with cattle wealth enabling a man to take multiple wives, each of whom would establish her own household within the broader family complex. Children were raised within this extended family structure, learning their roles and responsibilities through observation and participation in daily activities. Boys would spend time herding cattle, gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew, while girls assisted with agricultural work, food preparation, and childcare. This childhood experience in the natural environment, dealing with livestock and learning to read the signs of weather and season, created a hardy people well adapted to their landscape. Among the more powerful chiefdoms in the region at the turn of the 19th century were the Mthethwa, led by their chief Dingiswayo, and the Ndwandwe under Zwaid. These larger polities had begun experimenting with new forms of military organization, moving beyond the traditional loose assemblies of warriors toward more structured and permanent fighting forces. Dingiswayo in particular was known for his relatively enlightened approach to conquest, preferring to absorb defeated enemies rather than destroy them, building a larger confederation of peoples united under his paramount authority. This policy of incorporation, rather than annihilation, would prove influential, providing a model that would be both followed and exceeded by his most famous protégé. It was into this world of competing chiefdoms, pastoral wealth, and traditional warfare that a child was born who would change everything, whose very name would become synonymous with military genius and terrifying effectiveness, and whose legacy would inspire both pride and controversy for generations to come. In the year that would later be recorded as 1787, though his people marked time by the cycles of the moon and the passing of seasons rather than European calendars, a boy was born who would become known to history as Shaka. His birth itself violated Zulu custom and brought shame upon his parents, creating circumstances that would shape his character and fuel the burning ambition that would drive him to unprecedented heights of power and conquest. His father, Senzangakona, was the chief of the small Zulu clan, while his mother, Nandi, was the daughter of a chief from the neighbouring Langeni people. According to the traditions of their society, their relationship was inappropriate because they belonged to the same larger clan grouping, and intimate relations between members of the same clan were forbidden. When Nandi became pregnant, the matter caused significant scandal. Initially, the pregnancy was denied or attributed to an intestinal condition caused by an intestinal beetle, called Shaka in the Zulu language. When the baby was eventually born, he was given the name Shaka, referencing this initial denial, a name that would carry connotations of illegitimacy and shame. The relationship between Senzangakona and Nandi deteriorated rapidly, and when the boy was approximately 6 years old, mother and son were sent away from the Zulu clan, beginning a period of exile and hardship that would profoundly influence the young Shaka's development. Mother and son first went to the Langeni people, Nandi's birth clan, where they hoped to find acceptance and support. Instead, they encountered rejection and abuse. The stigma of Nandi's relationship with Senzangakona followed them, and neither mother nor son found the welcoming refuge they had sought. Young Shaka faced relentless bullying from other boys, who mocked him for his illegitimate status and his fatherless condition. His only real emotional support came from his mother, to whom he developed an intensely close bond that would last his entire life, and whose death would eventually contribute to his own destruction. The experience of being an outcast, of being mocked and diminished by those who should have been his peers and protectors, created in Shaka a fierce determination to prove himself superior to his tormentors, and a burning resentment that would never entirely fade. The Langeni eventually drove Nandi and her son away entirely, forcing them to seek refuge elsewhere. They finally found shelter with the Mthethwa people, specifically with a sub-clan called the Dletsheni. Here, Shaka's circumstances began to improve. As he grew into adolescence and young adulthood, his physical gifts became increasingly apparent. He grew tall and strong, developing the powerful physique that would make him a formidable warrior. More importantly, he discovered that physical prowess and martial skill could earn him the respect and status that his birth circumstances had denied him. In combat and physical contests, he could prove himself superior to those who had once mocked him, and this discovery shaped his future focus on military excellence as the path to power and prestige. When Shaka reached his early 20s, the Mthethwa paramount chief Dingiswayo called up the young men of Shaka's age group for military service, as was customary in the developing Amabutho system of age-based military regiments. Shaka eagerly embraced this opportunity, throwing himself into military training with an intensity that set him apart from his peers. He quickly distinguished himself not merely through physical courage, though he possessed that in abundance, but through his tactical thinking and his willingness to question traditional methods. Where others accepted the established ways of warfare without reflection, Shaka constantly analyzed what worked and what didn't, seeking ways to gain advantage over opponents. Under Dingiswayo's command, Shaka participated in numerous campaigns and proved himself an exceptional warrior and an innovative military thinker. He came to the attention of Dingiswayo himself, who recognized the young man's extraordinary talents and began grooming him for leadership. The paramount chief's mentorship proved crucial, exposing Shaka to broader strategic thinking beyond mere battlefield tactics. Dingiswayo's policy of building a confederation through conquest and incorporation, rather than simple destruction of enemies, provided a model that Shaka would later adapt to his own purposes. The years spent serving under Dingiswayo transformed Shaka from a physically gifted young warrior into a sophisticated military leader with a comprehensive vision for how warfare could be revolutionized and how that revolution could be used to build political power on an unprecedented scale. During this formative period, Shaka began developing the innovations that would later define Zulu military dominance. He experimented with different fighting techniques, particularly in close-quarters combat. He questioned the effectiveness of the traditional long-throwing spear, recognizing that while it worked well for the ritualistic warfare of the past, it had serious limitations. Once a warrior had hurled his spears, he was left largely defenseless unless he could retrieve them or had additional weapons. The distance fighting that characterized traditional warfare also meant that casualties were often relatively light, and battles could drag on inconclusively. Shaka envisioned a different kind of warfare entirely, one based on swift, decisive, close combat that would destroy enemy forces utterly rather than simply outmaneuvering them or claiming a limited victory. Shaka worked with blacksmiths to develop a new type of spear, which would come to be called the ikulwa, named for the sound it allegedly made when withdrawn from a victim's body. This weapon featured a much larger blade than the traditional spear, with a broader, leaf-shaped point that could be 18 inches or more in length and nearly 2 inches wide at its broadest point. The shaft was dramatically shorter than the traditional throwing spear, perhaps only 30 inches long, creating a weapon optimized for stabbing rather than throwing. This design made it impossible to throw effectively, forcing warriors to close with the enemy for hand-to-hand combat, but it also made it far more deadly in close quarters, capable of inflicting massive, immediately fatal wounds. Warriors who lost their ikulwa faced severe punishment, even execution, ensuring that this valuable weapon would not be carelessly discarded or lost. Alongside the new spear, Shaka advocated for changes to the traditional shield. He promoted the use of a larger shield, the isilangu, which stood about 5 feet tall and was made from the thick hide of cattle. This massive shield provided much better protection than smaller versions and could also be used offensively. Warriors were trained to hook their shield behind an enemy's shield and push it aside, exposing the opponent to a lethal thrust from the ikulwa. The shields were color-coded by regiment, with younger warriors carrying predominantly black shields and older, more experienced warriors carrying shields with more white coloring. This system allowed commanders to easily identify different units on the battlefield and coordinate their movements accordingly. The shields remained property of the king, stored in specialized structures when not in use, a policy that helped maintain central control over the military apparatus and reduce the risk of armed rebellion. Perhaps most famously, Shaka insisted that his warriors fight barefoot rather than wearing the traditional sandals. This decision, wildly unpopular when first implemented, was enforced with characteristic ruthlessness. Any warrior who objected finding himself simply killed, a practice that quickly convinced the survivors to accept the new policy. Shaka believed that fighting barefoot made warriors faster and more agile, better able to maneuver quickly on the battlefield. To toughen the feet of his troops, he reportedly had them stamp thorny branches flat in mass exercises, gradually building calluses that would allow them to move swiftly over rough terrain that would slow sandal-wearing opponents. This seemingly small change contributed to the overall mobility advantage that would become a hallmark of Zulu military success. The opportunity to put these innovations into practice on a large scale came when Shaka's father, Senzangakona, died around the year 1816. The succession should have passed to Sigujana, Shaka's half-brother. But Dingiswayo saw an opportunity to install his protégé as chief of the Zulu. With Mthethwa military backing, Shaka returned to the people who had cast him out as a child, this time as their new ruler. Sigujana was quickly assassinated, removing the legitimate heir, and Shaka assumed control of the clan. His first acts as chief revealed the pattern that would characterize his reign. Ruthless elimination of potential rivals and immediate implementation of sweeping military reforms. Anyone associated with his father's regime who might challenge his authority was killed. The Zulu, numbering perhaps 1,500 people, were about to become the nucleus of something far greater and far more terrible than anyone could have imagined. Now invested with real authority, Shaka began implementing his military vision with the full force of his will and backed by his patron's power. He immediately reorganized the Zulu military along new lines, creating the refined Amabuto system that would become the foundation of Zulu military might. This system organized warriors into regiments based on age, with all men reaching a certain age in a given period being formed into a unit together. These age-set regiments served multiple purposes. They created strong bonds of loyalty and mutual dependence among men who trained, lived, and fought together. They allowed for more coordinated tactical movements than the old system of individually armed warriors fighting as they saw fit. They established a clear command structure with appointed officers, the Izinduna, who enforced discipline and communicated orders during battle. The young men inducted into these regiments lived in military kraals, special fortified settlements established throughout Zulu territory. These barracks separated warriors from their home communities, preventing divided loyalties and ensuring constant availability for military service. Life in the military kraals was Spartan and highly regimented. Warriors underwent continuous training in the use of their weapons, practiced battlefield formations until they could execute them perfectly, and were subjected to frequent forced marches that built their endurance to extraordinary levels. Shaka reportedly had his regiments march more than 50 miles in a single day, an astounding feat that gave Zulu armies the ability to appear where enemies least expected them, and to concentrate force with devastating speed. The discipline imposed on these warriors was absolute and often brutal. Cowardice in battle meant death. Failure to follow orders meant death. Losing one's weapons meant death. This harsh system created an army where soldiers preferred to face enemy spears rather than risk their commander's wrath, where retreat was simply not an option, and where the only acceptable outcome was complete victory or honorable death. The psychological effect of this discipline, combined with the physical prowess developed through constant training, created warriors who were utterly fearless in combat, knowing that any alternative to victory would result in their execution anyway. This terrible certainty removed hesitation and doubt from the battlefield, creating soldiers who attacked with a ferocity that shocked and overwhelmed their opponents. Marriage was forbidden to warriors until the king specifically gave permission for an entire regiment to marry, typically after they had served for many years and proven themselves in battle. This policy served multiple purposes. It ensured that young warriors had no competing loyalties or responsibilities that might distract them from military service. It gave the king a powerful incentive to offer, as permission to marry was desperately desired by warriors who had spent years in enforced celibacy. It also allowed the king to control population growth and the formation of family alliances, preventing the rise of alternative power centers that might challenge royal authority. When a regiment was finally allowed to marry, it became a major celebration, with the warriors transitioning from their role as active soldiers to become reserve warriors who would return to military service only in times of crisis. With these reforms in place, Shaka possessed the military instrument he needed to pursue his larger ambitions. The stage was set for a period of conquest and expansion that would transform the political landscape of southeastern Africa, create an empire from scattered chiefdoms, and earn the Zulu warrior a reputation for martial excellence that would echo down through the centuries, inspiring both admiration and horror in equal measure. The foundations had been laid for one of the most effective military machines in African history, an army that would achieve stunning victories against overwhelming odds and would give even the mighty British Empire pause when the two forces finally clashed decades later. Yet these military innovations were not created in isolation or simply drawn from Shaka's imagination. They built upon existing trends and practices already developing among various Nguni peoples. Other chiefdoms had begun using shorter spears for close combat. Other leaders had experimented with age-based regiment systems. Other warriors had discovered advantages to fighting barefoot in certain circumstances. What made Shaka exceptional was not necessarily the invention of entirely new concepts, but his ability to synthesize various elements into a comprehensive system. His ruthless determination to implement that system completely, and his strategic vision for how military superiority could be translated into political dominance. He was, in essence, a military revolutionary who understood that warfare was merely a tool for achieving larger political objectives, and who possessed the will and the means to use that tool with unprecedented effectiveness. The young Zulu chief also demonstrated considerable diplomatic skill when it suited his purposes. He understood that not every conflict required military solution, and that sometimes incorporation of weaker neighbors could be achieved through intimidation or the promise of protection rather than through actual violence. Chiefdoms that submitted voluntarily might be treated with relative leniency, allowed to maintain some degree of internal autonomy while acknowledging Zulu supremacy. Those who resisted, however, faced the full fury of Shaka's armies, serving as terrible examples that encouraged others to submit without fight. This combination of military might and strategic use of terror and mercy allowed Shaka to expand Zulu power rapidly, absorbing numerous neighboring groups and transforming the Zulu from a minor clan into a significant regional power in just a few years. The military innovations implemented by Shaka would prove their worth in the crucible of battle, where theory would be tested against reality, and where the new Zulu way of war would demonstrate its superiority over traditional methods. The opportunity to prove these methods would come soon enough, as the expansion of Zulu power inevitably brought conflict with other ambitious leaders who had their own visions of regional dominance. The collision between these competing powers would determine the future of the entire region and would establish whether Shaka's revolutionary approach to warfare was truly as effective as he believed, or whether it would prove inadequate against enemies who possessed greater numbers and resources. The answers to these questions would be written in blood across the hills and valleys of southeastern Africa in battles that would be remembered and recounted for generations to come. The most brilliant military innovation attributed to Shaka Zulu was not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but rather a tactical formation that revolutionized how battles were fought and won in southeastern Africa. This formation, known as the Impondo Zankomo, translated variously as beast's horns, bull's horns, or buffalo horns, represented a sophisticated approach to battlefield tactics that allowed the Zulu to consistently defeat larger forces and to encircle and annihilate enemy armies, rather than simply pushing them back. The formation's elegant simplicity concealed a complex coordination requirement that could only be executed by well-trained, disciplined troops capable of moving rapidly and responding to battlefield developments without breaking formation or losing cohesion. The Buffalo Horns formation divided the Zulu army into 4 distinct components, each with a specific role to play in the overall battle plan. At the center of the formation was the chest, called the Isifuba, consisting of the most experienced and reliable warriors. These veteran soldiers would advance directly toward the enemy's front, engaging them in what appeared to be a conventional frontal assault. Their job was to fix the enemy in place, to hold their attention, and prevent them from maneuvering freely. The chest had to be strong enough to withstand enemy counterattacks, and brave enough to maintain pressure, even when facing superior numbers or fierce resistance. These were not glory-seeking charges, but rather controlled advances, maintaining formation and continuing to press forward steadily, giving the enemy no opportunity to organize an effective counterattack or to realize what was happening on their flanks. While the chest engaged the enemy's attention, the 2 horns, or Izimpondo, would sweep out to either side in wide, curving movements designed to envelop the enemy's flanks and eventually close behind them, completing an encirclement. These horns were composed of younger, faster warriors, men who possessed the speed and endurance necessary to cover the greater distances required by their flanking movements. The left and right horns had to coordinate their movements carefully, advancing at the proper pace to maintain the overall formation, while also moving quickly enough to prevent the enemy from repositioning to meet the flanking threat. The warriors in the horns needed exceptional discipline, as they had to resist the temptation to charge directly at the enemy and instead maintain their sweeping movement, trusting that the chest would hold the enemy in place until the encirclement was complete. The 4th and final component of the formation was the loins, or Isiwabo, which served as a reserve force held back from the initial engagement. These warriors would literally sit with their backs to the battle, so they would not become excited by the fighting and rush forward prematurely. The loins provided multiple crucial functions. They could be committed to any point where the Zulu forces were struggling, reinforcing the chest if it began to falter, or supporting one of the horns if it encountered unexpected resistance. They could pursue fleeing enemies once the encirclement was complete and the enemy force began to collapse. They also served as a last line of defense if the battle went poorly, providing covering force to allow the rest of the army to withdraw. The positioning of the loins behind the battle line required remarkable discipline, as warriors had to maintain their position even while hearing the sounds of combat nearby and while comrades were fighting and dying within sight. The coordination required to execute the Buffalo Horns formation was extraordinary, particularly in an era before radio communication or other modern command and control technologies. Orders were communicated through a hierarchy of commanders, with the overall battle plan being set by senior Izinduna before the engagement began. Once battle was joined, coordination relied on a combination of pre-planned timing, visual signals, and messengers who would run between different parts of the formation carrying updated orders. The senior commanders, often including the king himself when he was present, would typically position themselves on high ground where they could observe the battle's progress and send orders to the various regimental commanders as situations developed. These regimental Izinduna were responsible for implementing orders within their units and for making tactical decisions about how to respond to immediate threats or opportunities. Lower-level commanders, comparable to non-commissioned officers in modern armies, played absolutely crucial roles in maintaining order and discipline during the chaos of battle. Like Roman centurions before them, these junior leaders were responsible for keeping their men in formation, for identifying warriors who were flagging or showing cowardice and either encouraging them or eliminating them, and for ensuring that the unit continued to execute its assigned role even when casualties mounted and when the situation appeared desperate. The importance of these battlefield leaders cannot be overstated, as they were the hinge upon which the entire system turned. An army of brave warriors without effective small unit leadership would dissolve into an uncoordinated mob, but warriors of even moderate courage, when well led and tightly organized, could achieve remarkable results. The Buffalo Horns formation was designed specifically to take advantage of the Zulu army's key strengths: superior speed and mobility, excellent close combat weapons and training, and exceptional discipline and cohesion. It forced battles to be fought on Zulu terms, at close quarters where the Iklewa could do its terrible work, rather than at distance where enemies might maintain formation and use superior numbers or missile weapons to their advantage. By encircling enemy forces, the formation eliminated the possibility of retreat, meaning that battles would continue until one side or the other was completely destroyed. This ensured decisive results, preventing the inconclusive engagements that had characterized earlier warfare in the region, but it also made every battle potentially catastrophic for the losing side, as encircled warriors who could not retreat faced annihilation. The psychological impact of the Buffalo Horns formation was as important as its tactical effectiveness. Enemies who realized they were being encircled, who saw Zulu warriors appearing on their flanks and rear, even as they fought desperately against the frontal assault, experienced terror that could break even brave warriors. The knowledge that the Zulus sought not merely to defeat, but to completely destroy enemy forces, combined with the visible evidence of encirclement closing around them, often caused enemy formations to collapse even before the encirclement was complete, with warriors fleeing in panic and being cut down by pursuing Zulu forces. This reputation for utterly destroying opposing armies served as an effective tool of intimidation, encouraging many potential enemies to submit to Zulu demands rather than face the prospect of annihilation on the battlefield. The formation was not without its limitations and vulnerabilities. It required room to maneuver, making it less effective in confined spaces or heavily wooded terrain, where the sweeping movements of the horns would be blocked. It was most effective against enemies who would stand and fight, accepting battle on relatively open ground where the Zulu could execute their tactical plan. Enemies who refused to give battle, who withdrew before the encirclement could be completed, or who fought from behind fortifications, could negate many of the formation's advantages. Additionally, the formation required numerical superiority, or at least parity, as dividing forces into chest, horns, and loins meant that no single part of the Zulu army would be overwhelmingly strong, making the formation vulnerable if an enemy could concentrate their forces against one component before the others could provide support. Despite these limitations, when conditions were favorable, and when executed by well-trained warriors under capable leadership, the Buffalo Horns formation proved devastatingly effective. It allowed the Zulu to win battles against numerically superior forces, to achieve complete victories rather than marginal successes, and to build a reputation for military invincibility that served them well in both war and diplomacy. The formation would remain the core Zulu tactic throughout the empire's existence, used with modifications appropriate to specific circumstances, but always retaining its essential character as an encirclement and annihilation strategy. The integration of firearms into Zulu military doctrine presented interesting challenges and revealed much about the nature of their warfare. As European traders and colonists established greater presence in the region, Zulu warriors increasingly encountered and sometimes captured firearms, particularly muskets and later rifles. However, the Zulu never fully embraced firearms as their primary weapons, and this was not simply due to conservative attachment to traditional methods. The practical realities of 19th century firearms made them less effective for Zulu tactics than might be assumed. Black powder muskets and even early rifles required considerable time to reload, were unreliable in wet weather, and were most effective when used by massed formations firing volleys at close range, a tactic that contradicted the mobile, fast-moving nature of Zulu warfare. Warriors who captured firearms often kept them more as status symbols than as practical weapons, and when they did use them in battle, they typically lacked the training and ammunition necessary to employ them effectively. The Zulu manufacturing base could not produce firearms or gunpowder, meaning that every shot fired represented an irreplaceable resource once initial supplies were exhausted. In contrast, the Ikalwa could be used repeatedly, required no ammunition beyond the warrior's own strength, and could be manufactured by local smiths using readily available materials. Additionally, firearms produce smoke when fired, and in the confusion of battle, this smoke could obscure vision and make coordination more difficult. The noise of gunfire could also interfere with communication on the battlefield, making it harder for commanders to make themselves heard or for warriors to hear tactical directions. When the Zulu did employ firearms, they tended to use them in the opening stages of battle, attempting to disrupt enemy formations before closing for hand-to-hand combat. Some regiments might be designated as skirmishers, armed with whatever firearms were available, and sent forward to harass the enemy and provoke them into premature movements. However, the core of Zulu military power remained the massed infantry armed with spear and shield, executing the buffalo horns formation with disciplined precision. This reliance on traditional weapons, rather than attempting to transform into a firearms-based army, actually proved advantageous in many circumstances, as it meant the Zulu were not dependent on external sources for weapons and ammunition, maintained tactical flexibility and mobility, and could fight effectively even when facing enemies with firearms, whose rate of fire was often insufficient to stop a rapidly advancing Zulu charge before it closed to hand-to-hand range. The comparison between Zulu tactical innovations and other military developments in history reveals interesting parallels. The emphasis on decisive battle, complete destruction of enemy forces, and the use of encirclement tactics echoes ancient military theorists and successful commanders throughout history. The Carthaginian general Hannibal's victory at Cannae in 216 BCE employed a similar double envelopment to encircle and destroy a much larger Roman army. The coordination of multiple battle groups working toward a unified tactical objective resembles the combined arms approach that would later characterize modern military operations. The emphasis on mobility, aggressive action, and decisive results over prolonged positional warfare anticipated many concepts that would become central to military thinking in later centuries. Shaka and the commanders who followed him demonstrated sophisticated tactical understanding that would not have been out of place in any military academy, even though their knowledge was gained through experience and observation rather than formal study of military theory. With the military system firmly established and proven effective through numerous smaller engagements, Shaka turned his attention to expanding Zulu power and building what would become a substantial regional empire. The method of expansion combined military conquest with diplomatic pressure, strategic alliances, and the calculated use of terror. Chiefdoms in the path of Zulu expansion faced a clear choice: submit voluntarily and be incorporated into the growing Zulu state with some measure of autonomy and respect, or resist and face complete destruction. This policy encouraged many smaller groups to accept Zulu supremacy without fighting, recognizing that resistance would be futile and would only bring devastation upon their people. Those who chose to fight and lost often saw their entire population killed or scattered, their cattle taken, their settlements burned, and their very existence as a distinct people erased. The process of incorporating conquered peoples into the Zulu state was more sophisticated than simple annexation. Young men from defeated chiefdoms would be formed into new Amabutho regiments, integrated alongside Zulu warriors in a deliberate policy designed to break down ethnic distinctions and create a unified Zulu identity. After serving in these mixed regiments for years, fighting alongside warriors from other backgrounds, and forging bonds of shared experience, these former enemies would come to identify primarily as Zulu, rather than as members of their original groups. This process of military service as a means of cultural assimilation proved remarkably effective, allowing the Zulu to absorb numerous different groups and create a larger, more unified state than would have been possible through conquest alone. The chiefs of incorporated groups might be allowed to continue ruling their people, but they did so as subordinates of the Zulu king, required to provide tribute in cattle and warriors when called upon, and forbidden from conducting independent foreign policy or making war without royal permission. This system created a hierarchical structure with the Zulu king at the apex, paramount over numerous subsidiary chiefs who maintained day-to-day authority over their own people, but who had clearly lost their independence and sovereignty. The result was a state that combined the efficiency of centralized military control with the practical advantages of localized administration, allowing the king to mobilize substantial forces quickly, while not requiring a massive bureaucratic apparatus to govern every village and homestead directly. The expansion brought the Zulu into conflict with more powerful neighbors who had their own ambitions for regional dominance. The most significant early threat came from the Ndwandwe Confederation led by Zwaid, a formidable leader who ruled over a substantial territory and who commanded armies that outnumbered Shaka's forces. The conflict between these two powers was probably inevitable, as both sought to dominate the same region, and neither was willing to accept subordinate status to the other. The showdown came at the Battle of Gokokli Hill, fought around the year 1819, an engagement that would prove decisive in determining the future of the region, and that would demonstrate conclusively the effectiveness of Shaka's military reforms. Shaka, facing a numerically superior Ndwandwe army, employed strategy rather than simply accepting battle on his enemy's terms. He evacuated civilians and cattle from areas the Ndwandwe would pass through, denying them the food and resources they would need to sustain their army in the field. He avoided direct confrontation until the Ndwandwe forces were tired and hungry from marching through deliberately empty territory. When battle finally came at Gokli Hill, Shaka had chosen ground that favoured his tactics, with room to manoeuvre and execute the Buffalo Horns formation. The battle raged for 2 days, an unusually prolonged engagement that tested the endurance and discipline of both sides. The Ndwandwe fought bravely, but they were facing a new type of warfare for which their traditional methods provided no effective counter. The Zulu Buffalo Horns formation worked exactly as designed. The chest fixed the Ndwandwe army in place with relentless frontal pressure, preventing them from manoeuvring freely. The horns swept around the enemy flanks, moving swiftly over the terrain and gradually closing the encirclement. As the Ndwandwe warriors realized they were being surrounded, their formation began to waver and then collapsed entirely. What followed was not simply a defeat, but a massacre, as the Zulu systematically killed the fleeing Ndwandwe warriors, showing no mercy and taking virtually no prisoners. Zwaid himself escaped, but his military power was broken. The Ndwandwe Confederation collapsed, with its component groups either submitting to Zulu rule or fleeing the region entirely, contributing to the wider upheaval that would come to be known as the Mfecane. The victory at Gokli Hill established Shaka as the dominant power in the region and confirmed the superiority of his military system. The reputation earned in this battle preceded Zulu armies in subsequent campaigns, with enemies often choosing submission over facing the fate of the Ndwandwe. Over the following years, Shaka expanded Zulu territory dramatically, pushing outward in all directions from the original small Zulu homeland. To the north, south, and west, chiefdom after chiefdom either submitted or was destroyed. The population under Zulu control grew from the original 1,500 to perhaps 250,000, a staggering increase achieved in little more than a decade. The Zulu kingdom became the dominant power in southeastern Africa, controlling territory from the mountains to the sea, and possessing military capabilities that would have allowed further expansion had Shaka's ambitions been unlimited. However, the expansion came at an extraordinary human cost that extended far beyond the Zulu kingdom's borders. The violence unleashed by Zulu military expansion triggered a massive chain reaction of displacement and conflict, known as the Mfecane, sometimes translated as the crushing or the scattering. Groups fleeing from Zulu armies moved into territories occupied by other peoples, triggering further conflicts and displacements. Some of these refugee groups, adopting military innovations learned from or developed in response to the Zulu, became conquerors themselves, spreading warfare across vast areas of southern and even eastern Africa. The Ngoni people, for example, fled north from the Zulu expansion and eventually settled in areas that would become Malawi, Zambia, and Tanzania, bringing Zulu-style military organization and tactics with them, and disrupting established societies across thousands of miles. The scale of disruption and death during the Mfecane period remains debated among historians, with estimates of casualties ranging from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million people killed through warfare, starvation, and disease in the territories affected directly or indirectly by the conflicts. Entire peoples were destroyed or dispersed, with survivors often incorporating into other groups or forming new identities entirely. Agriculture was disrupted across wide areas, leading to famine that killed many who had survived the actual fighting. The landscape of southeastern and eastern Africa was fundamentally transformed, with population distributions, ethnic identities, and political structures all being radically altered in the space of just 2 or 3 decades. While Shaka and the Zulu were not solely responsible for all of this chaos, as other factors including environmental stress and the disruptions caused by the expanding trade in enslaved people also played roles, the Zulu military expansion was clearly a major driver of the wider regional upheaval. The Mfecane's effects would shape southern African history for generations. Areas that had been densely populated were left nearly empty, creating what European colonists would later describe as vacant land, available for settlement, conveniently ignoring or remaining ignorant of the recent catastrophic events that had created this apparent emptiness. Political structures that had existed for generations were destroyed, replaced by new kingdoms and confederations formed by or in response to the conflicts. The population map of the entire region was redrawn, with groups living in territories that they would have considered foreign just a generation earlier. The cultural and linguistic landscape was also transformed, as groups that had been distinct were absorbed into larger entities or disappeared entirely, while new identities formed among the survivors and displaced populations. For the Zulu themselves, the expansion created both unprecedented power and significant vulnerabilities. The rapid growth from tiny clan to substantial kingdom meant that many of the newly incorporated peoples had not fully absorbed Zulu identity and might prove unreliable in a crisis. The military system, while effective, required constant warfare to maintain, as warriors needed to be blooded in battle and rewarded with captured cattle and the glory of victory. A prolonged peace might allow the military system to decay, or might create unrest among warriors who found themselves confined to military kraals without purpose. The very success of the expansion had eliminated most nearby enemies, meaning that further conquests would require longer campaigns into distant territories, stretching supply lines and increasing the risks of disaster. Additionally, the centralization of power in the hands of the king created stability as long as the king was capable and strong, but it also meant that weakness or instability at the center could bring the entire structure crashing down. Shaka's growing paranoia and increasingly erratic behavior in his later years, particularly after the death of his beloved mother Nandi, would eventually contribute to his assassination by his own half-brothers in the year 1828. His death could have led to the collapse of the Zulu state, but instead, his successor Dingain managed to maintain the kingdom's power and coherence, demonstrating that the structures Shaka had created were resilient enough to survive the loss of their creator. The kingdom would continue to dominate the region for another 50 years until it faced a threat that no amount of martial prowess or tactical brilliance could ultimately overcome: the expansionist ambitions of the British Empire backed by industrial military technology. The daily life of a Zulu warrior provides insight into how the military system functioned beyond the battlefield and reveals the comprehensive nature of the society Shaka had created. A young man's journey to becoming a warrior began in childhood, as boys learned the basic skills they would need through herding cattle, an activity that taught responsibility, developed physical endurance, and created familiarity with the natural environment. Boys would engage in stick fighting with their peers, a ritualized form of combat that was simultaneously play and training, teaching basic combat skills and establishing hierarchies within age groups. These stick fights could be serious affairs, with injuries not uncommon, and they served as a proving ground where boys could establish reputations for courage and skill that would follow them into warrior service. When a group of young men reached the appropriate age, typically in their late teens or early 20s, they would be called up by the king to form a new Ibutho regiment. This was a significant moment, marking the transition from boyhood to warrior status, and beginning a period of perhaps 10 to 15 years of active military service. The new warriors would be assigned to a military kraal, a special settlement established specifically to house warriors and located strategically throughout Zulu territory. These kraals were not simply barracks, but complete communities, with all the infrastructure needed to support a military force. They included accommodations for the warriors, storage facilities for weapons and shields, areas for training and drilling, and quarters for the commanders and their families. Life in the military kraal was highly regimented and focused entirely on military preparation. Warriors would wake early and spend much of the day in physical training, weapon drills, and practice of the formations and maneuvers they would need to execute in battle. Physical conditioning was emphasized heavily, with frequent long marches designed to build the extraordinary endurance that characterized Zulu warriors. These marches might cover 50 miles or more in a single day, moving at a steady run that could be maintained for hours, a pace that would exhaust most untrained individuals within minutes. The ability to cover vast distances quickly gave Zulu armies remarkable strategic mobility, allowing them to appear where enemies least expected and to concentrate force rapidly against divided opponents. Combat training emphasized practical skills rather than elaborate techniques. Warriors learned to use the Ikaelwa effectively, practicing the stabbing motions and understanding how to exploit openings in an opponent's defense. They learned to work in coordination with their shields, using them both defensively and offensively. They practiced the buffalo horns formation endlessly until every warrior understood his role and could execute the maneuvers instinctively, even in the chaos and confusion of actual battle. Training also included psychological conditioning, designed to eliminate fear and hesitation. Warriors were taught that death in battle was honorable and preferable to showing cowardice, that their brothers in the regiment depended on their courage, and that failure would bring shame not just to themselves but to their entire family and clan. The regiment itself became a warrior's primary identity and loyalty. The men who served together formed bonds deeper than those with biological brothers, having shared hardship, danger, and the intense experiences that warfare creates. The regiment had its own identity, signified by shield colours, distinctive ornaments worn by its members, and the great deeds it had accomplished in battle. A warrior's personal identity became subsumed within the regimental identity, a psychological transformation that served military objectives by ensuring that warriors would fight not just for themselves, but for the honor of their regiment, and would be willing to die rather than bring shame on their brothers. This regimental pride and loyalty provided powerful motivation that complemented the fear of punishment in maintaining discipline and ensuring cohesive action under fire. Despite the military focus, life in the kraals was not entirely grim. There were periods of rest between campaigns when warriors could relax, socialize, and engage in various leisure activities. Singing and dancing were important aspects of Zulu culture, with warriors performing elaborate dances that also served as training for warfare, the movements mimicking combat actions while building physical coordination and group cohesion. The production and consumption of traditional beer provided social lubrication and was an important part of celebrations and rituals. Warriors would tell stories of past battles, embellishing their own roles and building the mythology of regimental prowess that inspired pride and motivated younger warriors to equal or exceed the achievements of their predecessors. The prohibition on marriage for active warriors represented a significant sacrifice and was a source of considerable frustration. Young men who would normally have been establishing families and beginning their adult lives instead remained in enforced celibacy, separated from normal social life and unable to pursue the domestic concerns that occupied most of their society. This policy ensured that warriors had no divided loyalties and remained focused entirely on military service, but it also created tensions that required careful management. The promise that warriors would eventually be allowed to marry provided crucial motivation, giving men a future to look forward to and ensuring that they would not despair at their circumstances. When a regiment was finally given permission to marry, usually after perhaps 15 years of service and after the warriors had begun to show signs of age, it was an occasion of tremendous celebration and marked the transition from active warrior to reserve status. The isilangu shield that each warrior carried was more than just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of identity and status. Shields were made from the hide of cattle, carefully selected and prepared to create the strongest and most resilient protection possible. The hide would be stretched over a wooden frame and allowed to dry, creating a stiff but relatively lightweight shield that could withstand spear thrusts and deflect blows. The color of the shield indicated the warrior's age and experience, with younger warriors carrying predominantly black shields and older warriors carrying shields with increasing amounts of white. This color coding allowed commanders to instantly identify different regiments on the battlefield and helped maintain the hierarchical structure of the army. The shields remained property of the king rather than of individual warriors, stored in special structures when not in use and distributed when the regiment was called to war. This policy had practical benefits, as it ensured proper maintenance of the shields and prevented them from being damaged or lost through careless handling. It also served a political purpose, maintaining central control over military equipment and reducing the risk that warriors might use their weapons against the king himself. A warrior who lost his shield in battle faced severe punishment, as the shield was considered essential equipment that no warrior should abandon under any circumstances. The emphasis on never losing one's shield or spear reinforced the broader military ethos that retreat and defeat were unacceptable, that warriors must prevail or die trying. Before battle, warriors underwent elaborate rituals designed to prepare them psychologically and spiritually for the coming conflict. Inyanga herbalists would prepare powerful medicines, mixtures of plant and animal materials that were believed to provide protection, enhance courage, and bring victory. Warriors would be given medicines to drink and would have their bodies washed with special preparations, rituals that served both spiritual purposes and practical psychological functions, reinforcing confidence and creating a sense of invulnerability that could become self-fulfilling on the battlefield. War doctors would perform ceremonies asking ancestors to favor the army and to grant victory over enemies. connecting the coming battle to the broader spiritual world and giving cosmic significance to what might otherwise be simply a violent struggle for survival or dominance. The actual experience of battle, when it came, was intensely physical and terrifyingly immediate. The buffalo horns formation meant that warriors in the chest would advance directly toward enemy forces, maintaining their lines even as spears flew toward them and as enemy warriors prepared to meet their charge. The moments before contact were filled with tremendous tension as warriors worked themselves into a psychological state necessary to charge forward into potentially lethal danger. War cries, rhythmic chanting, and the stamping of feet on the ground all contributed to building aggressive energy and suppressing the natural human instinct for self-preservation that might cause warriors to hesitate or flee. When the lines finally met, the fighting was brutal hand-to-hand combat at its most primal. Warriors would attempt to hook their shields behind enemy shields and wrench them aside, exposing opponents to lethal Iklewa thrusts. The design of the Iklewa meant that wounds were typically massive and immediately fatal, the broad blade causing catastrophic injuries that killed within seconds. The close-packed nature of the fighting meant that warriors were literally face-to-face with their enemies, able to see the fear and determination in opposing eyes, able to smell the sweat and blood, unable to escape the visceral reality of what they were doing. The noise would have been overwhelming, with thousands of men shouting, screaming, grunting with effort, and crying out in pain, creating a wall of sound that made verbal communication nearly impossible. For warriors in the horns, the experience was somewhat different, as they would be moving rapidly around the enemy's flanks, covering ground quickly while maintaining formation and watching for the moment when they could close the encirclement. These warriors needed extraordinary endurance, as they might run for miles before even engaging the enemy, and they needed discipline to maintain their sweeping movement rather than being drawn into premature fighting that might disrupt the overall tactical plan. When the encirclement finally closed and the enemy realized they were surrounded, the psychological impact often caused enemy formations to collapse, with warriors attempting to flee only to find Zulu forces on all sides. The pursuit and killing of fleeing enemies, while perhaps less dangerous than the initial contact, was psychologically demanding in its own way, requiring warriors to continue killing men who were no longer fighting back, turning battle into execution. The aftermath of battle brought its own challenges and rituals. Warriors who had killed enemies underwent cleansing ceremonies designed to remove the spiritual pollution associated with taking human life. The belief that contact with death created spiritual danger that could harm the warrior or his community, if not properly addressed, meant that even victorious warriors needed to be ritually purified before returning to normal social life. These ceremonies served important psychological purposes as well, helping warriors process the traumatic experiences of combat and providing a structured way to transition from the violence of war back to the relative peace of normal existence. The distribution of captured cattle to successful warriors provided tangible reward for service and risk, though the king retained the largest share of any spoils, reinforcing the hierarchy and ensuring that warriors remained dependent on royal favor for their prosperity. The experiences of warfare created a particular mindset among Zulu warriors, a combination of fearlessness born from constant training and harsh discipline, pride in martial prowess and regimental identity, and a sense of invincibility derived from repeated victories. This warrior culture celebrated military virtues above all others, creating a society where status and respect were earned primarily through combat success. Young boys grew up hearing stories of great battles and legendary warriors, aspiring to equal or exceed those achievements, and establishing their own reputations for courage and skill. The society as a whole organized itself around military imperatives, with civilian life subordinated to the needs of the military system. and with the king's authority resting primarily on his command of the warrior regiments, rather than on purely traditional or religious sources of legitimacy. Yet this military culture coexisted with other aspects of Zulu society that were less warlike and that reflected values of community, family, and spiritual connection. The enforced celibacy of active warriors created a sense that military service was a temporary, if prolonged, phase of life, rather than a permanent identity. Warriors knew they would eventually be allowed to marry, leave the military kraals, establish their own homesteads, and raise families. This expectation meant that even the most dedicated warriors maintained connections to civilian life and retained an understanding that warfare was a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The ultimate goal was not death in battle, but rather honorable service, leading to a peaceful life with family and cattle. The traditional measures of success and prosperity in Nguni society. The role of women in this military society was complex and has often been overlooked in accounts that focus exclusively on male warriors. Women remained responsible for agriculture, food preparation, and childcare, maintaining the economic foundation that supported the military apparatus. Women also served as the primary preservers of cultural knowledge, teaching children the history, customs, and values of their people. The mothers, sisters, and eventual wives of warriors provided emotional support and practical assistance that helped maintain morale and cohesion. Women could also accumulate significant power and influence within their spheres, particularly as they grew older and became mothers or even grandmothers of warriors, positions that commanded respect even in this patriarchal society. The spiritual life of the warriors remained deeply important despite the practical military focus of their daily existence. Belief in ancestors, in the power of medicines and rituals, and in the presence of spiritual forces in the natural world, provided psychological resources that helped warriors cope with the trauma and stress of military life. The sense that ancestors were watching and that brave, honorable behavior would be rewarded not just in this life, but in the afterlife, provided additional motivation beyond fear of punishment or desire for material reward. The integration of spiritual practices into military routine, such as the ceremonies before battle and the cleansing rituals after combat, created a comprehensive system that addressed both physical and psychological needs, recognizing that warriors were not simply fighting machines, but human beings who needed spiritual and emotional support to maintain their effectiveness over long periods. As the Zulu kingdom reached its height under Shaka and then continued under his successors, Dingaan and later Mpande, the warrior system became increasingly institutionalized. The initial revolutionary energy that had driven Shaka's reforms gradually gave way to a more established routine, with the military system becoming simply the way things were done, rather than an exciting innovation. This institutionalization brought both stability and rigidity. The system functioned smoothly because everyone understood their roles, and because decades of successful use had worked out most of the practical problems. However, the very success of the system created resistance to further innovation, as commanders who had achieved great victories using established methods saw little need to change approaches that had proven effective time and again. This conservative tendency would become problematic when the Zulu faced enemies who fought in fundamentally different ways and who possessed technologies that negated many of the Zulus' traditional advantages. The buffalo horns formation, devastating against enemies who fought in similar ways with similar weapons, offered few advantages against enemies who could kill at ranges of hundreds of yards with accurate rifle fire and who could pour out sustained fire from positions of strength. The courage and discipline that made Zulu warriors supreme in hand-to-hand combat became liabilities when they charged against prepared defensive positions protected by modern weapons, with brave men dying in waves before they could close to effective range. The very military culture that had been a source of strength, its emphasis on aggressive attack and its refusal to accept retreat or defensive tactics prevented adaptive responses that might have offered better chances of success against technologically superior foes. The collision between the Zulu kingdom and the British Empire was probably inevitable, given the expansionist nature of both powers and their occupancy of overlapping spheres of interest in southeastern Africa. The British had established a presence at the Cape of Good Hope in the late 18th century and had gradually expanded northward, driven by a mixture of economic interests, strategic concerns, and the expansionist ideology that characterized European colonialism in the 19th century. The British initially dealt with the Zulu kingdom as an independent power, maintaining diplomatic relations and generally respecting Zulu sovereignty. However, as British ambitions grew and as the discovery of diamonds and gold in the region increased the economic stakes, the independent Zulu kingdom came to be seen as an obstacle to British control over all of southeastern Africa. By the late 1870s, the British government in South Africa, under Sir Bartle Frere, had decided that the Zulu kingdom needed to be brought under British control. The official justifications for this decision included claims that King Cetshwayo, who had assumed the throne in 1872, was a threat to British subjects and to neighbouring peoples, that his military system was inherently aggressive and destabilising, and that British intervention was necessary to bring civilization and Christianity to the region. These justifications conveniently ignored the fact that Cetshwayo had actually been remarkably restrained in his use of military force, that he had attempted to maintain good relations with the British, and that the Zulu kingdom had been largely peaceful in the years immediately preceding the British decision to invade. The proximate cause of war came through an ultimatum delivered to Cetshwayo in December of 1878. The British demanded that the Zulu kingdom effectively dismantle its entire military system, requiring that the Amabutho regiments be disbanded, that warriors be allowed to marry when they chose, rather than requiring royal permission, and that British advisors be accepted to oversee the implementation of these and other demands. The ultimatum was crafted specifically to be unacceptable, as the British knew that no Zulu king could agree to dismantle the very system that maintained his power and that had defined Zulu identity for 6 decades. The ultimatum gave Cetshwayo 30 days to comply with these impossible demands, and when he inevitably failed to do so, the British used this as justification for invasion. In January of 1879, a British force of approximately 17,000 men, including both British regulars and colonial troops, crossed into Zulu territory in 3 separate columns. The plan was to converge on the Zulu capital of Ulundi, crushing any opposition and forcing Cetshwayo's surrender. The British were confident of victory, as their forces were equipped with modern rifles, artillery, and even a Gatling gun, weapons that should have made them invincible against warriors armed primarily with spears and shields. The British commander, Lord Chelmsford, anticipated a relatively straightforward campaign, expecting to overawe the Zulu with superior firepower and to crush any resistance quickly. This confidence was about to be shattered in what would become one of the most stunning military defeats in British imperial history. The central column of the British invasion force established a camp at the base of a distinctive hill called Isandlwana, a formation resembling a sphinx that dominated the surrounding plain. The camp was not properly fortified despite being in hostile territory, an oversight that reflected British confidence in their firepower and their underestimation of Zulu capabilities. On the morning of January 22nd, 1879, Lord Chelmsford took roughly half of his force out of the camp to pursue what he believed was the main Zulu army. This divided the British force, leaving approximately 1,800 men in the camp at Isandlwana under officers who did not expect to face significant action. What happened next would become one of the most studied military disasters in British history and one of the greatest triumphs of the Zulu warrior tradition. A large Zulu force, estimated at 20,000 warriors, had been concealed in a valley near the British camp, waiting for the opportune moment to attack. When they were accidentally discovered by British scouts, the Zulu commanders made the decision to attack immediately rather than allowing the British to prepare. The Zulu army moved out from concealment and formed their buffalo horns formation, advancing toward the British camp with the chest, horns, and loins all moving to their designated positions. The British, realizing they faced a massive assault, attempted to form defensive lines and bring their superior firepower to bear. For a time, it appeared that British rifles and artillery might be able to stop the Zulu advance through sheer volume of fire. The British troops fired volley after volley into the advancing Zulu regiments, killing hundreds and then thousands of warriors. Yet still the Zulu came on, individual regiments suffering devastating casualties, but never breaking, never retreating, continuing to advance with a courage that awed even their enemies. The younger warriors in the horns moved with extraordinary speed, racing around the British flanks and beginning to complete the encirclement, even as the chest continued to absorb horrific losses from concentrated rifle fire. The British began to realize, too late, that they were facing an enemy whose tactical sophistication and sheer determination had negated their technological advantages, and that the encirclement closing around them would mean annihilation if they did not break free immediately. As the Zulu horns closed around the British positions, panic began to spread among the defenders. Units that had fought bravely found themselves being attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, with Zulu warriors appearing in their rear and on their flanks even as the frontal assault continued. The British lines began to fragment, with soldiers attempting to retreat toward the camp or to escape the encirclement entirely. The Zulu warriors, trained for exactly this moment, pressed home their attack with terrible efficiency. Once they closed to hand-to-hand range, their Ikalwa spears proved devastating, and the British bayonets, while formidable weapons in trained hands, could not match the close combat expertise of warriors who had trained for years specifically for this kind of fighting. The battle turned into a massacre. British soldiers, separated from their units and surrounded by Zulu warriors, fought desperately, but were systematically killed. The camp itself was overrun, with Zulu regiments pouring through it and hunting down anyone attempting to hide or escape. Some British troops managed to break through the encirclement and attempted to retreat toward the nearest river crossing, but they were pursued by Zulu warriors and cut down in flight. Of the roughly 1,800 British and colonial troops who had been in the camp that morning, only about 55 Europeans survived the battle, most of them having escaped before the encirclement was complete. Several hundred African troops fighting for the British also survived, many by removing their uniforms and attempting to blend in or escape unnoticed. The Zulu had achieved a complete victory, destroying a modern, well-equipped force and proving that courage, tactical skill, and determination could still triumph over technological superiority under the right circumstances. The aftermath of Isandlwana shocked the British Empire. The loss of nearly an entire column, including the regimental colours of the 24th Regiment of Foot, was a humiliation that demanded response. Yet the battle had also demonstrated the enormous capabilities of the Zulu military system, and had proven that conquering the Zulu kingdom would require far greater effort than initially anticipated. News of the defeat reached Britain and caused a political crisis, with the government forced to explain how a modern army equipped with the most advanced weapons could be destroyed by warriors armed primarily with spears. The victory also had profound effects on Zulu morale and confidence, proving that the warriors could stand against European military power and suggesting that perhaps the kingdom could maintain its independence despite British aggression. However, the victory at Isandlwana contained within it the seeds of ultimate defeat. The Zulu had achieved their triumph through the buffalo horns formation and aggressive close combat, tactics that worked brilliantly when circumstances allowed them to close with the enemy before being destroyed by rifle fire. The battle had succeeded largely because the British had failed to properly fortify their camp, had divided their forces, and had been surprised by the speed and scale of the Zulu attack. When the British learned from their mistakes and adopted proper defensive tactics, the Zulu warrior tradition would find itself unable to adapt quickly enough to overcome the fundamental technological disadvantage they faced. The very military culture that had brought victory at Isandlwana, with its emphasis on aggressive assault and its disdain for defensive or cautious approaches, would prove catastrophic in subsequent battles where the British refused to be drawn into fighting on Zulu terms. On the same day as the great victory at Isandlwana, another engagement occurred that illustrated both the strengths and limitations of the Zulu military system. A reserve Zulu force, numbering perhaps 4,000 warriors, attacked a small British outpost at Rorke's Drift, a mission station and supply depot defended by approximately 150 British soldiers. Unlike the camp at Isandlwana, Rorke's Drift had been hastily fortified with barricades of mealie bags and biscuit boxes, creating a defensive perimeter that channeled attacking forces and provided the defenders with protection. Throughout the afternoon and night, Zulu warriors launched repeated assaults on the British position, displaying remarkable courage and determination. Warriors advanced directly into devastating rifle fire, attempting to break through the barricades or to fire the buildings that formed part of the defensive position. Yet despite their numerical superiority and despite fighting with their customary bravery, the Zulu warriors could not overcome the combination of defensive fortifications and sustained rifle fire. The battle raged for 12 hours before the Zulu finally withdrew, having suffered perhaps 500 casualties while inflicting only 17 deaths among the defenders. The heroic defense of Rorke's Drift became legendary in British military history, with 11 Victoria Crosses awarded to defenders, the most ever given for a single engagement. For the Zulu, the battle demonstrated the terrible price of attacking prepared positions defended by modern rifles, a lesson that would be confirmed repeatedly in subsequent battles, but that their warrior culture and tactical doctrine could not adequately address. The contrast between Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift revealed the essential dynamic that would determine the outcome of the war. When the Zulu could force battle on their terms, using their mobility to achieve surprise and their aggressive tactics to close before British firepower could destroy them, they could win stunning victories. When the British refused to fight on Zulu terms, instead establishing fortified positions with clear fields of fire and fighting defensively, the technological advantage of rifles and artillery became decisive, and Zulu courage became merely a guarantee of high casualties rather than a path to victory. The outcome of the war would ultimately depend on whether the British could consistently impose their style of warfare, or whether the Zulu could force additional engagements like Isandlwana, where tactical skill and warrior spirit could overcome technological disparity. The weapons that Zulu warriors carried into battle represented both advanced indigenous technology and the limitations that would ultimately contribute to their defeat. The Ikalwa, that revolutionary spear that Shaka had developed decades earlier, remained the primary weapon of Zulu warriors throughout the Anglo-Zulu War. The design had been perfected, over years of use, with smiths understanding precisely how to forge the blade for optimal strength and sharpness, how to attach it securely to the shaft, and what length and balance made the weapon most effective in combat. The blade itself might be 18 inches long or even longer, crafted from iron that had been repeatedly heated, hammered, and folded to create a weapon that was both hard enough to hold an edge and flexible enough to resist breaking. The broad leaf-shaped blade tapered to a sharp point capable of piercing shields or armor, while the wide cutting edges could inflict massive wounds that killed almost instantly. The Ikalwa's shaft was much shorter than traditional throwing spears, typically only about 30 inches in length. This short shaft made the weapon awkward to throw, but perfect for the stabbing thrusts that were its primary use. The connection between blade and shaft was secured with bindings, with smiths taking great care to ensure that the blade would not separate during combat, as a weapon that came apart in the middle of battle was worse than useless. Warriors treated their ikilwa with great respect, maintaining the edges through regular sharpening and ensuring that the weapon was always ready for use. The loss of one's ikilwa was considered shameful and could result in severe punishment, reinforcing the importance of the weapon to warrior identity and to military effectiveness. Alongside the ikilwa, warriors typically carried one or two lighter throwing spears, called assegais. These represented the older tradition of warfare, serving as weapons that could be hurled at enemies from a distance before closing for hand-to-hand combat with the ikilwa. The throwing spears were longer and lighter than the ikilwa, designed for maximum range and accuracy rather than for stabbing effectiveness. In practice, these weapons were often thrown in the opening moments of battle, disrupting enemy formations and causing initial casualties before the Zulu closed for decisive melee combat. The throwing spears were less central to Zulu tactics than they had been in earlier times, but they remained useful tools that provided warriors with ranged options before the close quarters fighting that would determine the battle's outcome. The shield, or isihlangu, was as important as the spear in Zulu warfare. These shields were substantial pieces of equipment, standing perhaps 5 feet tall and constructed from the hide of cattle. The hide would be carefully selected, with different colours indicating different regiments and providing easy identification on the battlefield. The construction process involved stretching the hide over a wooden frame and allowing it to dry, creating a rigid but relatively lightweight shield. A central wooden pole ran vertically through the shield, providing structural support and also serving as a handle that the warrior could grip with one hand. Additional bindings along this central pole allowed the warrior to secure their grip and to maneuver the shield effectively in combat. The shield served multiple purposes in Zulu warfare. Most obviously, it provided protection against enemy weapons, capable of stopping or deflecting spears, and even of providing some protection against sword or bayonet thrusts. The thick hide could absorb significant damage before failing, and warriors learned to angle their shields to deflect rather than directly block attacks, extending the shield's useful life. Beyond its defensive role, the shield was also an offensive weapon. Warriors were trained to use the shield to hook behind enemy shields and pull them aside, exposing opponents to ikilwa thrusts. The shield could also be used to batter and push opponents, disrupting their balance and creating opportunities for attacks. The shield's colour indicated the warrior's age and regimental affiliation, making it a badge of identity as well as a piece of equipment. In addition to spears and shields, many warriors carried a knobkerry, called an iwisa in Zulu. This was a substantial wooden club with a heavy knob at one end, crafted from a single piece of hardwood, chosen for its density and strength. The knobkerry served as both a weapon and a tool, useful for delivering crushing blows in close combat, but also practical for everyday tasks during peacetime. Warriors who had lost their spears, or who found themselves in extremely close quarters, where a spear would be unwieldy, might resort to the knobkerry, using it to batter opponents with powerful blows that could shatter bones or crush skulls. The weight and reach of the knobkerry made it an effective weapon despite its simple design, and warriors trained with it just as they trained with their spears, understanding that proficiency with all their weapons might mean the difference between life and death in battle. As the Zulu encountered European weapons through trade and conquest, some firearms entered Zulu hands. The most common firearms captured or acquired by the Zulu were muskets and later rifles, including significant numbers of Martini Henry rifles captured at Isandlwana. These were powerful weapons capable of killing at ranges where traditional Zulu weapons were completely ineffective. However, the Zulu never successfully integrated firearms into their military system in a way that fundamentally altered their tactical approaches. Part of the problem was logistical. The Zulu had no capacity to manufacture firearms or ammunition, meaning that captured weapons were only as useful as the ammunition available, which was quickly exhausted in battle. Firearms also required considerable training to use effectively, particularly in terms of marksmanship and understanding ballistics, training that most Zulu warriors never received. Additionally, the firearms of the period had significant limitations that reduced their effectiveness in Zulu hands. Black powder weapons created substantial smoke when fired, obscuring vision on the battlefield. Rifles required time to reload after each shot, a period during which the shooter was vulnerable. The weapons were prone to mechanical failures and could become useless if powder got wet or if components broke. For warriors trained from childhood in the use of spears and shields, warriors whose entire tactical system was built around rapid movement and aggressive close combat, attempting to fundamentally change to firearms. Based warfare represented an enormous challenge that the Zulu never adequately addressed. Some warriors used captured rifles in battle, but typically in supplementary roles, firing them in opening volleys before reverting to traditional weapons for the decisive fighting. The comparison between Zulu weapons and the rifles used by their British opponents reveals the immense technological gap that would ultimately doom the Zulu kingdom, despite the warriors' courage and skill. The Martini Henry rifle used by British infantry could accurately hit targets at several hundred yards and could be fired and reloaded by trained soldiers at a rate of perhaps 10 to 12 rounds per minute. This meant that a British soldier could potentially kill or wound 10 or more advancing warriors before they could close to hand range, a tremendous advantage that no amount of courage could entirely overcome. Artillery provided even longer range firepower, capable of killing at distances of thousands of yards and of firing explosive shells that could kill or wound multiple warriors with a single shot. These technological advantages meant that the Zulu needed to achieve surprise, use terrain to screen their advance, or find some other way to close with the enemy quickly, or else they would simply be destroyed by firepower before reaching their opponents. The traditional weapons that had served the Zulu so well against opponents armed similarly remained effective and even superior in the close quarters combat that was their goal. But the battlefield was changing in ways that made achieving close combat increasingly difficult. The Industrial Revolution had transformed warfare, creating weapons whose lethality at range meant that the final stage of battle, the hand-to-hand combat, where courage and skill determined outcomes, might never be reached if defenders could maintain discipline and sustained fire. The Zulu warrior tradition, for all its sophistication and effectiveness, had developed in a context of relatively similar weapons technology among all combatants. When faced with the products of industrial military technology backed by the enormous resources of the British Empire, the traditional warrior way of life would prove inadequate, not through any lack of courage or tactical skill, but simply because spears and shields, however skillfully wielded, could not overcome the enormous advantages provided by rifles, artillery, and the industrial capacity to produce them in unlimited quantities. The cultural significance of weapons extended beyond their practical utility. A warrior's spear and shield were symbols of his identity and status, markers that distinguished him as a warrior rather than a civilian. The care with which warriors maintained their weapons, the pride they took in keeping them ready for use, and the shame associated with losing them all reflected the deeper cultural meaning attached to these tools of war. In many ways, the weapons embodied the warrior ethos itself. The ikolwa represented aggressive, decisive action and the willingness to close with enemies rather than fighting from distance. The shield represented both protection of oneself and one's comrades, and the aggressive use of defense as offense. The combination of the two represented the balance of prudence and aggression that characterized effective Zulu tactics. When warriors ritually prepared their weapons before battle, They were not just performing practical maintenance, but also engaging in symbolic actions that reinforced their identity and purpose. Following the stunning victory at Isandlwana, the momentum of the Anglo-Zulu War might have shifted in favor of the Zulu kingdom had they been able to follow up their success with additional victories, or had the British chosen to withdraw from Zulu territory rather than reinforcing their invasion. However, neither of these outcomes materialized. The British response to the disaster at Isandlwana was not to abandon the invasion, but rather to massively reinforce their forces in South Africa and to adjust their tactics to prevent a repeat of the circumstances that had led to their defeat. Lord Chelmsford, whose decisions had contributed to the disaster, remained in command and was determined to redeem his reputation by crushing the Zulu kingdom and capturing or killing King Cetshwayo. The British government, while shocked by the losses at Isandlwana, was also committed to the invasion for both practical and prestige reasons, unwilling to appear weak by withdrawing in the face of defeat. The Zulu, for their part, found that their victory at Isandlwana had costs that partially negated its benefits. The regiments that had fought in the battle had suffered substantial casualties despite their victory, with perhaps 1,000 warriors killed and many more wounded. These losses, while sustainable for a kingdom that could field armies of tens of thousands, nevertheless represented a significant depletion of military strength. More importantly, the Zulu had exhausted much of their accumulated ammunition in the battle and had captured some British rifles and ammunition, but not enough to fundamentally alter their capabilities. The logistics of maintaining large armies in the field, always a challenge in pre-industrial societies, became increasingly difficult as the war continued, with warriors needing to be fed and supplied, while the normal agricultural and pastoral cycles that sustained the kingdom were disrupted by military mobilization. King Cetshwayo, despite his stunning military success, attempted to open negotiations with the British, hoping that the defeat at Isandlwana might have convinced them to accept a negotiated settlement rather than continuing a costly war. He sent messages indicating his willingness to discuss terms and his desire to avoid further bloodshed. These overtures were rejected. The British had committed too much prestige and too many resources to accept anything less than complete victory, and the very fact of the Zulu victory at Isandlwana made British authorities more rather than less determined to crush the kingdom entirely, both to avenge the defeat and to demonstrate that military setbacks could not deter British imperial expansion. The war would continue, and the outcome would ultimately be determined not by the bravery or tactical skill of individual warriors, but by the industrial and material resources that the two sides could bring to bear. The reinforced British forces adopted new tactics designed specifically to counter the Zulus' military strengths. Rather than marching in isolated columns that could be attacked and destroyed individually, the British forces moved more cautiously and maintained better coordination between units. Most importantly, when establishing camps, the British now created fortified positions with clear fields of fire, using wagons to form lagers that provided protection and channeled any attacking force into killing zones where concentrated rifle fire could decimate them before they could close to hand-to-hand range. British commanders also made better use of their artillery, positioning guns to cover approaches to their positions and to break up massed Zulu charges before they could reach British lines. These tactical adjustments, learned from the disaster at Isandlwana, largely negated the Zulu advantages in mobility and close combat prowess, forcing battles to be fought on British terms rather than Zulu terms. The Battle of Kambala, fought on March 29, 1879, demonstrated the effectiveness of these new British tactics. A large Zulu force, perhaps 20,000 strong, attacked a fortified British position on a hilltop. The British had prepared extensively, creating defensive works and positioning their artillery for maximum effectiveness. The Zulu warriors, attacking with their customary courage and determination, advanced directly into withering rifle and artillery fire. Wave after wave of warriors charged the British positions, attempting to close to hand-to-hand range where their spears could be effective. But the sustained firepower from the defenders cut them down before they could reach the defensive perimeter. The battle lasted for hours, with Zulu regiments suffering appalling casualties but continuing to attack, demonstrating both incredible bravery and the fundamental problem with their tactical doctrine when facing modern defensive positions. The British defenders, while hard-pressed at times, maintained their positions and ultimately drove off the Zulu assault with relatively light casualties of their own, while inflicting perhaps 2,000 killed on the attackers. The defeat at Kambula shattered the sense of invincibility that the Zulu had gained from Isandlwana and demonstrated that frontal assaults against prepared British positions would result in catastrophic losses without achieving victory. The Battle of Gingindlovu on April 2nd reinforced these lessons. Once again, a large Zulu force attacked a fortified British position, and once again, massed rifle fire and artillery devastated the attackers before they could close to effective range. The Zulu warriors fought with characteristic bravery, attempting to break through the defensive perimeter despite the casualties they were suffering. But courage alone could not overcome the technological disparity. The British square formation, with rifles firing outward on all sides and with artillery positioned at the corners, created a killing zone that advancing Zulu warriors had to cross, and the casualties they suffered in that crossing were simply unsustainable. The Zulu tactics that had proven so effective against similarly armed opponents proved catastrophic against enemies who could kill at range and who refused to allow the close combat where Zulu advantages would become decisive. These defeats did not break Zulu resistance, but they did demonstrate that the kingdom could not defeat the British through conventional military means. King Cetshwayo attempted various strategies to avoid complete destruction of his kingdom. He continued seeking negotiations, hoping that perhaps British war weariness might create an opening for a reasonable settlement. He considered withdrawing into the interior, forcing the British to pursue him into increasingly difficult terrain where logistics and distance might exhaust their forces. He attempted to husband his remaining military strength, avoiding major battles that would further deplete his armies without achieving strategic gains. None of these strategies proved effective against British determination to end the war on their terms, which meant the complete destruction of Zulu military power and the capture or surrender of Cetshwayo himself. The final major engagement of the war came at Ulundi, the Zulu capital, on July 4, 1879. Lord Chelmsford, leading a large and well-prepared British force, marched on the capital determined to end the war decisively. The Zulu warriors, knowing that this would likely be the decisive battle, assembled in massive numbers, perhaps as many as 20,000 strong, prepared to defend their king and their capital. The British formed a large square formation in open ground near the capital, creating a mobile fortress with rifles facing outward on all sides and artillery positioned within the formation. This was exactly the kind of defensive position that had proven effective in earlier battles, and the result was tragically predictable. The Zulu warriors charged the British square repeatedly, attempting to break through the lines and reach close combat where their spears could be effective. The British rifles and artillery fired continuously, creating a storm of lead that cut down advancing warriors by the hundreds. The Zulu came close to breaking through at several points, with warriors reaching within a few yards of the British lines before being killed, but they could never quite close the final distance before the sustained fire drove them back or killed them entirely. The courage and determination of the Zulu warriors was remarkable, charging again and again into fire that must have seemed like an unnatural force. But their bravery only ensured high casualties rather than victory. After suffering perhaps 1,500 killed, the Zulu army finally broke and retreated, leaving the British in possession of the field and free to burn Ulundi to the ground, destroying the symbolic and practical centre of Zulu power. King Cetshwayo fled into the bush, hoping to evade capture and perhaps to continue resistance from hiding. For several weeks, he managed to avoid British patrols, moving from place to place with a small group of loyal followers. However, the British were determined to capture him, both to formally end the war and to demonstrate that resistance to British power was futile. On August 28th, Cetshwayo was finally captured, ending the independent existence of the Zulu kingdom after barely 6 months of war. The king was initially imprisoned and later exiled, his kingdom divided among appointed chiefs who were expected to govern under British supervision. The military system that had made the Zulu so formidable was dismantled, with the Amabutho regiments disbanded and warriors ordered to return to civilian life. The Zulu kingdom, which had dominated southeastern Africa for 60 years, had been destroyed not through any lack of courage or tactical skill on the part of its warriors, but through the inexorable application of superior technology and resources by an industrial imperial power. The destruction of the Zulu kingdom did not mean the destruction of the Zulu people, or the complete erasure of their warrior traditions. The warriors who survived the war returned to their communities, bringing with them the memories of battles fought and comrades lost. These veterans became the keepers of the military tradition, telling stories to younger generations about the great battles, the legendary warriors, and the time when the Zulu nation had been independent and powerful. The traditions of warriorhood, while no longer expressed through actual military service in independent Zulu armies, remained culturally significant, transformed from practical reality into commemorated memory and source of identity. The annual ceremonies and celebrations that had marked military life continued in modified form, serving as ways to maintain cultural continuity and to honor the sacrifices of previous generations. The British annexation of Zulu territory was complicated and incomplete, with various arrangements being tried and discarded over the following years. Cetshwayo was eventually allowed to return from exile in the early 1880s, but his kingdom had been divided among various chiefs, and he could never fully restore his authority. Civil war between factions supporting Cetshwayo and those aligned with his rivals further devastated the Zulu people. Eventually, Zululand was formally annexed by Britain in 1887, becoming part of the British colonial holdings in southern Africa. The Zulu people became subjects of the British Crown, their political independence lost, but their cultural identity maintained through conscious effort to preserve traditions and pass them to future generations. The legacy of the Zulu warriors extended far beyond the borders of their homeland and long beyond the brief Anglo-Zulu War. The Battle of Isandlwana became one of the most studied military engagements in history, analyzed by military historians and strategists seeking to understand how a supposedly primitive force could defeat a modern army. The tactical sophistication of the Buffalo Horns formation was recognized as genuine military innovation, worthy of study alongside the great tactical developments of any military tradition. The courage and discipline of the Zulu warriors became legendary, spoken of with respect even by their former enemies, representing a martial excellence that transcended technological advantages or disadvantages. The Zulu military system influenced military thinking in various ways, with some theorists pointing to it as evidence that morale and tactics could still overcome technological superiority, while others drew opposite lessons about the inevitable triumph of industrial military technology over traditional warfare. In South Africa itself, the memory of the Zulu warriors became intertwined with the complex history of colonialism, resistance, and nation-building. For Zulu people, the warrior tradition represented a source of pride and identity, a reminder of a time when their ancestors were powerful and independent, and a cultural foundation that helped maintain group cohesion through the difficult periods of colonial rule and apartheid. The traditional ceremonies, including the annual reed dance and other cultural events, incorporated elements of the warrior tradition, with young men performing dances that mimicked military movements and wearing regalia that recalled the appearance of the old warrior regiments. These cultural practices served multiple purposes: maintaining connection to ancestral traditions, providing sources of pride and identity in the face of discrimination and oppression, and preserving knowledge of the past for future generations. The establishment of the modern South African state in 1994, following the end of apartheid, created new contexts for understanding and celebrating the Zulu warrior tradition. The Zulu kingdom, which had nominally continued under British rule and later as part of independent South Africa, became a symbol of indigenous African political structures and resistance to colonialism. King Goodwill Zwelithini, who reigned from 1968 until his death in 2021, worked to preserve and promote Zulu culture and traditions, including the warrior heritage that remained such a significant part of Zulu identity. The king presided over various traditional ceremonies that incorporated military elements, maintaining visible connections to the warrior past, while adapting these traditions to modern circumstances, where actual military service was no longer the defining feature of young manhood. The cultural ceremonies that preserve elements of the warrior tradition serve important social functions in contemporary Zulu society. The Umkhosi Womhlanga, or reed dance, brings together young women from across Zululand in a celebration that includes traditional dress, dancing, and the presentation of reeds to the king. While primarily focused on young women, the ceremony also includes performances by young men who demonstrate traditional dances that incorporate movements derived from military drills and combat techniques. These performances maintain physical connections to the warrior past, with participants learning the movements, songs, and gestures that their warrior ancestors would have known. The precision and coordination required for these group performances echo the discipline that characterized the old Amabutho regiments, though now expressed in cultural celebration rather than military preparation. Similarly, the Shaka Day commemoration, held annually on September 24th, celebrates the memory of the great king who transformed the Zulu nation and created its military traditions. The day involves ceremonies at Shaka's memorial site, with participants wearing traditional regalia and performing war dances. Political leaders, cultural figures, and ordinary Zulu people gather to honor Shaka's memory and to celebrate the achievements of the Zulu kingdom during its period of independence and power. The commemoration serves to reinforce Zulu identity and pride, connecting contemporary Zulu people to their illustrious past and maintaining awareness of the warrior tradition, even in a world where that tradition no longer serves practical military purposes. These celebrations also attract tourists and cultural scholars, creating economic benefits while spreading knowledge of Zulu history and culture beyond the Zulu community itself. The warrior tradition has also influenced broader South African culture and identity in complex ways. The image of the Zulu warrior, strong, brave, and skillful, became a cultural icon that could be either celebrated or weaponized depending on political context. During the apartheid era, the warrior tradition was sometimes invoked by both the government and by resistance movements, with very different meanings attached to it. The government occasionally promoted tribal identities as a way of dividing black South Africans, while resistance movements sometimes drew on warrior traditions to symbolize strength and the willingness to fight oppression. In post-apartheid South Africa, the warrior heritage has generally been celebrated as part of the nation's diverse cultural heritage, with recognition that the Zulu kingdom was an important African civilization that demonstrated political sophistication and military excellence. The military history of the Zulu warriors has been studied extensively by military historians and strategists worldwide. The Battle of Isandlwana features prominently in military education curricula at various institutions, analysed as an example of how superior tactics, morale, and leadership can overcome technological disadvantages under certain circumstances. The Buffalo Horns formation is studied as an effective tactical innovation that achieved results similar to more famous double envelopment tactics from military history. The overall Zulu military system, with its emphasis on discipline, training, unit cohesion, and aggressive offensive action, is recognized as a sophisticated approach to warfare that achieved remarkable results given the available resources and technology. Military theorists have drawn various lessons from Zulu military history, with debates continuing about the relative importance of technology versus tactics, the role of morale and cultural factors in military effectiveness, and the conditions under which numerically inferior or technologically disadvantaged forces can achieve victory. The question of how to properly remember and commemorate the Zulu warrior tradition involves navigating complex historical and ethical terrain. The military achievements of the Zulu warriors were undeniable, demonstrating tactical sophistication, extraordinary courage, and remarkable effectiveness. However, those achievements were also purchased through violence and were part of larger processes that included conquest, displacement, and significant suffering among both Zulu enemies and Zulu subjects. The expansion of the Zulu kingdom under Shaka contributed to the Mafeking period of widespread conflict and displacement that affected millions of people across southern and eastern Africa. The harsh discipline of the military system meant that many young Zulu men spent years in enforced celibacy and constant military training, sacrificing personal happiness for military effectiveness. The celebration of warrior traditions must therefore be balanced with acknowledgement of the costs and complexities involved, recognizing both the genuine achievements and the human suffering that accompanied them. Modern scholarship on the Zulu kingdom and its military system has become increasingly nuanced, moving beyond simple narratives of either noble savage warriors or bloodthirsty conquerors to recognize the complex historical reality. Scholars have examined the economic, political, and environmental factors that contributed to the rise of the Zulu kingdom, recognizing that Shaka's innovations occurred within a broader context of regional competition and change. The military system is understood not just as the product of individual genius, but as a sophisticated response to specific challenges and opportunities, building on existing trends and practices while innovating in important ways. The impact of the Mafeking is debated, with some scholars emphasizing the destructive effects of Zulu expansion, while others note the multiple factors contributing to regional upheaval and question whether attributing the entire phenomenon to Zulu actions is historically accurate or is instead a narrative that conveniently justified later European colonization. The physical legacy of the warrior tradition can be seen in various sites across KwaZulu-Natal, the province where the historical Zulu kingdom was located. Battlefields from the Anglo-Zulu War have been preserved as heritage sites, with museums and interpretive centres providing information about the battles and their historical context. Sites like Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift receive thousands of visitors annually, both from South Africa and internationally, with people coming to understand the history and to stand on ground where momentous events occurred. These sites serve educational purposes, helping new generations understand the history of the region and the conflicts that shaped it. They also serve as places of commemoration, where the courage and sacrifice of warriors on both sides can be acknowledged and honoured. The traditional homestead at Shaka Land and other cultural villages offer visitors opportunities to experience elements of traditional Zulu life, including demonstrations of warrior training, weapons, and tactics. These presentations are necessarily somewhat sanitized and simplified for tourist consumption, but they nevertheless help preserve knowledge of traditional practices and provide economic opportunities for local communities. Young men who perform warrior dances and demonstrate traditional weapons are maintaining physical skills and knowledge that might otherwise be lost, even as they adapt these traditions to serve contemporary purposes rather than actual military functions. The commercialization of warrior traditions through tourism raises questions about authenticity and cultural commodification, but it also provides economic incentives for preserving traditions that might otherwise disappear as they become increasingly distant from contemporary life. Academic study of Zulu history and culture continues to produce new insights and understandings. Archaeologists excavate sites associated with the Zulu kingdom and earlier peoples, providing physical evidence that complements oral traditions and written historical records. Linguists study the Zulu language and its evolution over time, tracing how the language adapted to changing circumstances and how it both shaped and was shaped by Zulu culture. Anthropologists examine contemporary Zulu communities, studying how traditional practices and beliefs persist or change in modern South Africa. Historians continue to debate various aspects of Zulu history, from the details of specific battles to the broader significance of the Zulu kingdom in African and world history. This ongoing scholarship ensures that understanding of the Zulu warrior tradition continues to deepen and to incorporate new perspectives and evidence. The philosophical and ethical dimensions of the warrior tradition deserve consideration alongside the military and historical aspects. The warrior culture emphasized certain values that extended beyond combat effectiveness. Courage certainly was paramount, but not reckless bravery that served no purpose. Rather, the courage celebrated in warrior tradition was courage in service of the community, the willingness to face danger and death for the protection and benefit of one's people. Loyalty was similarly valued, both loyalty to one's comrades and to the king, creating bonds of mutual obligation that held society together. Discipline and self-control were essential warrior virtues, distinguishing trained soldiers from armed mobs and allowing coordinated action that multiplied individual effectiveness. These values, while developed in a military context, had broader application to life and could be understood as contributing to functional communities, whether in peace or war. The emphasis on collective identity and mutual dependence within the warrior system reflected broader African philosophical concepts, including Ubuntu, the idea that human beings are interconnected and that individual well-being is tied to community well-being. The warrior who fought bravely was not simply pursuing personal glory, but was fulfilling his obligations to his comrades and his community. The veteran who returned from war and shared his experiences with younger generations was maintaining the continuity of community memory and identity. The integration of military service into the broader life cycle, with warriors eventually being released to marry and establish families, recognized that the ultimate goal was not perpetual war, but rather the building and maintenance of prosperous, stable communities that could defend themselves when necessary, but that existed for purposes beyond warfare. At the same time, the warrior tradition could be critiqued from various ethical perspectives. The harsh discipline and ready use of execution for relatively minor infractions reflected a value system that prioritized military effectiveness over individual human life and dignity. The wars of conquest that built the Zulu kingdom caused immense suffering among conquered peoples, raising questions about whether military glory justified that suffering. The enforced celibacy and separation from normal social life imposed on young warriors for years deprived them of experiences and relationships that most cultures consider essential to human flourishing. The emphasis on military values potentially marginalized other important values, including compassion, peace-seeking, and the domestic virtues traditionally associated with women. A balanced assessment must acknowledge both the genuine achievements and positive values associated with the warrior tradition, while also recognizing its costs and limitations. As night settles over the hills and valleys where Zulu warriors once trained and fought, where battles determined the fates of kingdoms, and where individual warriors faced the ultimate test of their courage and skill, the landscapes retain a haunting beauty that invites reflection on the passage of time and the transformation of societies. The warrior culture that once dominated this region, that organized the lives of tens of thousands of young men, and that influenced the destinies of countless others, has passed into history, transformed from living reality into commemorated memory. Yet the values that the warrior tradition embodied, values of courage, loyalty, discipline, and commitment to community, retain relevance even in the vastly changed circumstances of the 21st century. The story of the Zulu warriors is ultimately a human story, one of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things, of individuals finding courage they didn't know they possessed, of communities organizing themselves to meet existential challenges, and of a people who, for a brief but remarkable period, demonstrated what disciplined human effort could achieve even with relatively simple technology and limited resources. It is also a story of tragedy, of lives cut short by violence, of suffering inflicted and endured, of a military system that demanded enormous sacrifices from those who served within it, and of a kingdom that, despite its achievements, could not withstand the overwhelming power of industrial empire. Both the triumphs and the tragedies deserve to be remembered, understood in their full complexity, rather than reduced to simple narratives of either glory or oppression. In the quiet hours when the immediate demands of daily life recede, and there is space for contemplation of larger meanings and longer histories, the warrior tradition invites reflection on timeless questions about human nature and society. What makes people willing to risk everything for their communities? How should courage be understood and valued? What are the proper relationships between individuals and larger social structures? How should military achievement be weighed against the human costs of warfare? What responsibilities do the living have to honor and remember those who came before, especially those who made great sacrifices? These questions have no simple answers, but the history of the Zulu warriors provides rich material for thinking through them, offering concrete examples of how one society addressed these challenges and what resulted from their choices. The complete story of the Zulu warriors, told with attention to military innovation, tactical sophistication, cultural context, individual experience, costs and benefits, achievements and failures, offers valuable perspectives on universal human questions, while also honoring the specific history and culture of the Zulu people. It is a story that continues to resonate, reminding us that history is always more complex than simple narratives suggest, that courage and skill matter, but do not always determine outcomes, that societies must balance military needs against other important values, and that the legacies of the past continue to shape the present in ways both visible and subtle. The Zulu warriors fought their battles, achieved their victories, suffered their defeats, and passed into history, leaving behind memories, monuments, and descendants who carry their legacy into an uncertain future, honoring what deserves honor while working to build better futures that preserve the best of traditional wisdom while transcending its limitations.